Are you depressed or suffering from a mood imbalance? Let's talk today about why a pill and manipulating serotonin may not be the solution. In fact, maybe our whole view of depression actually just came undone. I'm Dr. Sarah, and I want to talk to you today about why a lack of antidepressants and serotonin deficiencies aren't the only cause of depression and mood imbalances. The thing is, we might have already known that. Let me start off with a little bit of an introduction about what's been going on. First of all, there's been a hot debate on the efficacy of antidepressants and the accuracy of serotonin and its hypothesis and its link to depression. And this was spurred up again because there was a release of the results from a new analysis of a review of studies. And the media actually took this headline and a conclusion and said that basically the whole concept was basically debunked. So what does this mean for depression? What does it mean for people taking medications? What does it mean for mental health disorders? And what does it mean for psychiatry in general? I want to go over this with you. Specifically, I want to take a look at the study, what it does say, what it does report, and what got actually missed by the media. And I want to talk about the implications to mental health. And then specifically, I want to go through a more integrative approach and why that we need it so much right now with the mental health in our world. So first of all, let's start off with some of the sad statistics of mental health in America, because about 21% of adults are experiencing a mental illness, according to surveys in 2019 and 2020. And this is actually the equivalent of 50 million Americans. Depression is the most common psychiatric diagnosis. It affects about 5% of adults, and it is a major cause of disability in the world. We're talking about for social interactions, we're talking about for the ability to work, to function, to even get out of bed in the morning. And sadly, about 1/3 or about 28.2% of those suffering with these disorders aren't able to receive the treatment that they need. And our youth are also struggling. Those statistics were for adults, but it's been reported that over 1 in 10 young adults have depression that is so debilitating that it impairs their ability to function at school, at work, with their family, or their social life. And as a result, what's been happening because of all the world events that have been colliding into us and impacting our emotions and stress levels is there's been a raising number of people with mental health symptoms. A national mental health crisis was declared. So what happened is the government intervened, stepping in, saying these numbers are unacceptable. People are really struggling. They don't have access. How can we help? They wanted to increase access and treatments and resources, which is a very noble goal. And the problem is it's only addressing half of the equation. So sure, we're getting more access, which is very beneficial and helpful. The problem is, what if we're getting access to the wrong treatments that aren't working and aren't effective? More people are getting treatments, but it's not really moving the needle, and more people are still struggling, right? So what has been kind of accepted for a long period of time is that there's this chemical imbalance in the brain when someone has depression, specifically maybe related to the neurotransmitter serotonin, although other neurotransmitters have been coming to the forefront, and that if we balance these neurotransmitters, our mood will be better, right? So they've designed a lot of medications around this theory. The problem is that this theory hasn't withheld in a long time for a lot of psychiatrists and people in mental health. They already knew that this theory was lacking, right? There's been not direct evidence that targeting the serotonin signaling system is going to increase extracellular serotonin, and that's going to impact mood. In fact, fewer than 30% who are taking antidepressants actually have a response where they're going into full remission, right? So we need to look at this. And the problem is that back even years ago, there's been reviews about the biases of studies that are reporting that the effect is somewhat strong. In fact, what they've uncovered is maybe the studies were funded by the pharmaceutical lobbying industry, right? So there's a conflict of interest. Maybe their analysis wasn't as effectively done as well as it could to decrease some of the biases. One of the most recent meta-analysis reviews, so meta-analysis is taking studies that reviewed studies and compiling them all together and taking the results from that. So you're getting like one of the most recent ones that compared antidepressants to placebos, compared 522 trials, which was 116,477 participants. So these are large numbers. And there were clinical studies for 19 of these trials with 21 different antidepressants included and assessed across these trials. And the conclusion stated that the evidence does not support that the benefits for antidepressants outweigh the efficacy of a placebo, right? Because your placebo is already like 50%. What we think about, which I actually think is amazing that we can actually use for healing, actually impacts our biochemistry and our brain responds in a positive way. We can go positive or negative. That's another topic with another video that I actually have on my video channel. So let me pause here for a minute because this is a very passionate topic for me. As you can see, I forgot to mention that any of these resources and references that I'm going to be talking about in this video can be found in the link to the article in the video description. All the references will be included, as well as an overview in an article on this topic as well that you can read if you want to dive deeper into this. Now, so this was already known. So what I went through is that many people already knew, or many people in the mental health field already knew, that depression was more complex than this one single hit theory, right? There were other peer-reviewed studies that were done regarding adoption studies, twin studies, inflammatory research studies linking inflammation in the brain to depression. There's been animal studies looking at different pathways. Many of the psychiatrists and psychologists were already aware of this. So what happened that all of a sudden, again, it's getting kind of all this news and all this ruckus? Well, again, it was this recent review of findings. And what the authors did is they did an umbrella review. So an umbrella review is a meta-analysis of meta-analyses. They are taking a review of studies, compiling them together and putting them all under this umbrella and then they're running these advanced statistical models to come up with what is the results. And they're checking for biases. They're looking at what the trends were, right? Finding out, weeding out the studies and finding out what's the real deal here, right? So this used 17 different studies. There were 12 systematic reviews and meta-analyses. There was one collaborative meta-analysis. There was one meta-analysis of a cohort study. There was one systematic review and narrative synthesis, and one genetic association study, along with another umbrella review study. Now, the genetic association study is the serotonin transporter receptor, or the SERT receptor. They wanted to see if that impacted, obviously that would impact how much serotonin is going into the brain and if that would be related to depression. So you don't need to know all of that to understand, but if you are a researcher or clinician, you will understand what I just said, that this is kind of a big deal, like all of these different studies. What they did is they assessed for the levels of serotonin in its metabolite, which is 5-HIAA for those out there who want to know. And if the serotonin, they assessed if it was true, if the levels of these metabolites in serotonin were linked to a relationship with depression, if serotonin receptor levels were linked, if levels of the SERT gene were linked, if causing someone to have tryptophan depletion, which is a precursor to serotonin, if that caused depression, and then if there was this interaction between the SERT gene and stress. And what they found is that in the main areas of serotonin research, there was no consistent evidence of there being any association with serotonin and depression, and no support for the hypothesis that depression is caused by lowered serotonin activity or concentration. But there was some evidence that was consistent with the possibility that long-term antidepressant use did reduce serotonin concentration. Interestingly, right? So here we are having that serotonin concentration could be decreased, and that at the same time, for some people, they're reporting that this helps depression. So the media got a hold of these findings, had a field day, caused a stir, controversy started and ignited again. And again, one of the major issues was this serotonin quote unquote myth. Kind of many clinicians were just feeling this was much ado about nothing, right? They already knew this. And there were several things that I think are important that weren't highlighted in some of the media headlines. And if you just read those synapses and you don't really look into the study, that I want to point out for you so that you get a full picture. So what the media isn't highlighting, and what happens is they take studies and they kind of take the main points. If you just go by the main points, sometimes you miss some of the more important aspects of it. And sometimes the main points, if you miss these important aspects, it kind of changes the meaning of the study. So for this particular study, we want to conclude that there was some evidence that antidepressants did have an impact on depression. Okay, so it might not be the serotonin pathway that they're impacting it. That's another topic for another video that I'm going to do, but let's just leave it there for now. Okay, so then they also found that the effects of stressful life events and their frequency increase the risk of depression. So I've talked about before on my website, as well as in these videos, how chronic stress can actually lead to mental health disorders because of the way that the programs are neural pathways, right? This chronic stress can actually impact how our brain functions. So that makes sense. That wasn't highlighted in the media stir. And there were also some slight methodical flaws that when I read kind of the methods, one of them was that they included large studies that didn't employ actual conventional systematic review methods. So they might not have been as accurate in that finding. And then there was one large genetic study, which wasn't even an analysis. So they were compiling all these analyses, but that one wasn't. It was just a study, a cohort study. So that could have skewed results a little bit. Another big issue with any research in psychiatry or psychology, when you're measuring if something biologically is linked to any mood or mental health disorder, is there's no biological marker for it. There's no criteria that's set. So this is a whole different can of worms that I'm going to get into a little bit here, because what's happening is that we don't have tools to diagnose depression that are linked to biology or biochemistry, right? Like we can go to our doctor and get a cardiovascular panel, cholesterol, and kind of correlate that to the heart. There's no agreed upon ones for that in psychiatry. In fact, what they do use is based on symptom clusters, okay? So it's like they use the Diagnostic Statistic Manual for Mental Disorders, the DSM, and if you meet these certain criteria, you are diagnosed with a mental health disorder. Now, in 2013, what happened is the 5th edition of DSM-5 got released, and the National Institute of Mental Health noted some major problems with these categorizations, and it actually recommended against using these criteria for biological research. So basically, don't use criteria if you're going to correlate it to like this is the cause of depression based on this marker, based on this correct criteria from DSM-5. Don't do that. Now, what this did is it makes studies that are using, like if someone is depressed based on DSM criteria and comparing it to biology, kind of a moot point, right? So that's one big issue, right, is how we're defining depression and how we're linking it to these biological markers. Everybody can have, different reasons why they're depressed. It might, or why they have these symptoms, and it might not be depression based on different categories. So they're like, you're not supposed to do that. I'm repeating myself, but it's important. So now, another issue is the specificity of the tools. So that means that the tools that they use across different research studies actually are the same tools and they produce the same results every time. Not the case. So there was a study done by Freed, and he looked at 52 depression symptoms across 7 different scales for depression, including Hamilton scale, which is one of the most used. On average, each symptom appeared in 3 of the 7 scales. 40% of the symptoms appeared in only one scale. And this was reported in the Journal of Affective Disorders in 2017. Again, way before this study kind of got released. The only specific symptom that was common on all 7 scales was sad mood. So we're not only not treating depression correctly, potentially, we also have an issue of diagnosing the actual condition. So there's a great article in Psychology Today, and the author said that, again, the review is only documenting what is already known in general, that DSM diagnosis, like major depression disorder, does not correlate with any biological marker like serotonin. Since SRIs improved depressive symptoms somewhat in clinical trials, though much less than what people believe, it was assumed that depression had a basis in low serotonin. This would be like saying that since aspirin is a prostaglandin inhibitor, it reduces fever, then fever is a prostaglandin disorder. But really, prostaglandin effects is just one way to reduce a fever. It's the last step in reducing a fever. The real way to reduce the fever is to stop the cause of the fever, which could be a bacterial infection, so using an antibiotic. It was a direct quote from Psychology Today. I thought it was a good comparison of what's going on here. So what does this mean for mental health in general, for people with depression? First of all, I think you can rest assured that most of mental health providers, this isn't going to come to a shock with them. If they're using an antidepressant for you, it's probably because they know it might manipulate serotonin, but it might have other effects that we're not aware of that might be working for you. The second thing is we need a broader net of how we're working with brain health and mental health disorders, because obviously it's broken, right? We don't have correct access. We don't have great diagnostic tools, and we don't have great treatments as far as on the biological level. So psychology, talk therapy, some of these other methods do show clinical efficacy. As far as a biological treatment, not that great. But if we're looking at this from a multifactorial, systematic approach, and we're looking at all of the different things that impact how our brain functions, we can probably get better results. In fact, I've actually seen where people who are looking at several different markers can feel better. So some of the things I would look at for when my clients come in with a diagnosis or tell me that they're feeling sad or they have a mood imbalance, we look at things like inflammation and oxidative stress. We look at their nutrition and assimilation. We look at if there's any dietary triggers or mitochondrial dysfunction, right? The cellular energy in their brain, if that's not effectively functioning based on what's happening with lifestyle, etc. We look at hormones, right? Because we know estrogen affects serotonin in the brain, and we know that progesterone affects GABA, which is calming. We'll look at stress and cortisol levels, because again, stress is correlated to depression. We'll look at their microbiome because there's a gut-brain link. We'll look at if toxins are getting in the way or being assimilated into the brain, which could be impacting neurological functioning. Blood sugar levels, because when your blood sugar goes up and down, this impacts your mood and impacts your hormones and affects your brain health. We look at stealth infections, which are anything that might be underlying, like these chronic infections that are occurring. Childhood adversity impacts mood. So things that have gone kind of uncovered, but have been traumatic for people. Emotional tone, spirituality impacts mood and emotions. History of brain trauma, very important. Even if someone just maybe fell out of a tree and didn't think that much of it, that impacts brain functioning. Genetic variations in different genetic markers for different neurotransmitters or different ways that the body can detoxify will impact how well the brain is functioning. How the brain is either hyper, that's high or low in specific regions. These can be measured in different imaging techniques. Environmental stressors and technology overload can impact the brain, social support, and then someone's mindset and their beliefs. So that's a lot, right? But it's becoming obvious that we can't just look at one pathway to explain depression. And just like you can't just treat one number for cardiovascular health and expect someone to get better, right? So we need to look at more than defining these mental health issues as a cluster of symptoms, and we need to look at brain health. And this means exploring all these different factors. And I think that this should become the foundation of how do we look at the health of your brain? How are you, because how you live your everyday life overall, your lifestyle impacts your brain. It affects everything else. And then also clinicians, can be looking into the literature and looking for newer associative patterns that affect their particular client or patient, because this is really still a new field that we don't have a lot of great information about. So it's not a simple or short process. It does take some effort for both the practitioner and the client, but it's the only way I ethically feel that I can support my client's brain health. And again, this where what I do is I work in conjunction with a team, with someone's psychiatrist and someone's PCP, and we get an integrative approach. So we have to fully address the organ that is causing the symptoms, not just trying to suppress the symptoms with a pill that might not even be that effective. If you agree, I would love for you to comment. If you don't agree, comment and share this information with other people, because we are really, like I said, we're in a mental health crisis, and continuing to go after the problem with the tools that created the problem in the first place is what Einstein would say is a definition of insanity. So we need to stop. All right. I'm going to get off my soapbox now. You can tell I'm very passionate about this topic. And if you are interested in learning more, I do have a lot of free resources on my website. I have courses for using essential oils clinically for clinicians. I have it for consumers, essential oil courses. I also have a lot of blogs and a lot of other free resources for you that you are welcome to access. And I hope that you will use this information to empower yourself, and maybe even share it with your practitioner or your doctor, and get the best possible care for you and your brain and your body and your mind and your spirit that you possibly can. I thank you for listening, and I thank you for taking the time to learn a little bit more about brain health and why it is way more inclusive than just one simple solution. Take good care, and I'll talk to you soon.